though. Trying to figure things out here. So let's see. I know you guys can't see me. I'm trying to get my camera to work here, and then hopefully that will work out. You should be able to send me messages in chat, or I'm going to also have my Twitter up, so you can ask me questions via Twitter as well. I'm going to start at the very beginning and kind of work my way through. Hopefully things will work out here. So bear with me while I try to get this to work. Camera. Not sure if this is going to work. Had it working yesterday. Okay, well, I don't know if I can get the camera to actually work, which is fine. I can, I guess, talk to you this way, and you guys can chat with me if you have a question. And hopefully I can reach out to you guys. So I have my Twitter up, so you can either message me in the group chat, or you can message me online. Yesterday I had the video working, everything seemed fine, but for some reason today it doesn't want to work. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going. Unfortunately, you won't be able to see me, maybe not the end of the world. But I'm going to focus today mostly on what you need to know for the multiple choice. I do have a document that I'll share with you for information on thematic essays and some topics. I'm going to focus on areas that people had asked me to focus on in our questionnaire that I sent out to the class. So a lot of people wonder how far back they need to go when we are actually studying for this Regents. And when it comes to colonial America, there's typically not a lot of questions asked. You might see questions with like a map asking why the colonies were all on the East Coast along the Atlantic Ocean. And basically the extent of that is, well, when people came over from Great Britain to the 13 colonies, that's where they're going to hit. So for the very beginning, you know, for quite some time, most of our colonies are going to be on the East Coast because it's just convenience. And we're going to see that that's going to be the case well into the American Revolution. So What you should know, though, from the colonies are early forms of government. So things you should know are things like the Mayflower Compact. You should probably know like the New England town meetings or the House of Burgesses. These are all examples of early forms of self-government. So Mayflower Compact, people consent to be governed. They would abide by the decisions of their government. They could vote. House of Burgesses, basically a self-government. There was a representative democracy. And town hall meetings is a place where white landowner men could go participate, speak about issues that their community are facing, etc. When we get to the British colonies, a couple of things you should know and pay attention to is the term mercantilism. It's an economic policy. Basically, the colonies existed for Great Britain to make money off of them. They want raw materials. These raw materials would be taken back to Britain. They would be developed into finished products and sent back to the colonies to be sold to the people. The other thing that you should know about Britain in the colonies would be this idea of salutary neglect. So essentially, Great Britain is too busy fighting the French, and they essentially ignore the colonies, and the colonies able to develop their own self-rule, and it's kind of like, their own freedom. However, after the French and Indian War, this policy is ended. After the French and Indian War, Great Britain passes the Proclamation of 1763. This boundary at the Appalachian Mountains, and they tell the colonists that they can't settle beyond these mountains. And this is where we start to see a turn where colonists start to then question Great Britain's control over them. This will lead into a number of taxation policies. The French and Indian War was extremely expensive, and the British wanted to pay off those war debts. So they believed that since this battle or these battles were fought in the colonies, that the colonists should be paying for this war. The colonists start to be taxed by the British, and this is where we see boycotts begin to be established by the colonists against Great Britain. The Stamp Act being one of the first ones we looked at. There's also the Sugar Act and the Intolerable Acts, where all of these are going to be those early causes of the American Revolutionary War. So French and Indian War ends, taxation is going to increase, and colonists are going to turn against Great Britain. And this brings us into the American Revolutionary War. So you probably remember early in September talking about the Boston Massacre, where you have British soldiers clash with Bostonians. 5 colonists are killed. And what we see is Revere and the Sons of Liberty are going to use this Boston Massacre as a propaganda tool to turn colonists against Great Britain and get them to support this call for a revolution. Thomas Paine also gets in on this. He writes the pamphlet Common Sense. I keep telling you guys that common sense, hey, it makes sense that we should be independent from Great Britain. The Declaration of Independence will also be written. It is inspired by John Locke and the Enlightenment. They list all the issues that they have for Great Britain. They claim that people are entitled to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. If the government is not protecting those rights, then you have a right to overthrow that government. That's straight out of John Locke's ideas. And this is the justification for this Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War will begin. The United States obviously signs the Declaration of Independence. They declare their independence July 4th, 1776, but they'll continue to fight this battle into the 1780s before the Treaty of Paris finally ends the Revolutionary War in 1783. Great Britain will formally recognize the United States of America, and America now controls everything up to the Mississippi River except for Florida, which had still been part of Spain's colonies in the New World. All British troops were supposed to be removed from U.S. territories, but they are not. But what we see is we now enter this critical period in American history where new government needs to be developed. Because of the colonial experience, our founding fathers are fearful of having a very strong, powerful ruler. So they create the Articles of Confederation that has a very weak national government. There's no real central government. All the power belongs to the states. There's only one branch, the legislature, which basically can create laws, but there's no executive to carry out these laws. There's no judicial branch to interpret these laws. They can't collect taxes. They can ask money for the states, but much like asking your parents for money, they're probably going to say no. They don't want to part with that. The only real positive is this Northwest Ordinance, which is going to help the United States manage territories. And as these territories develop, how are they then going to be incorporated and become states within this new nation? What we see, though, is there's going to be a rebellion, Shays' Rebellion. And this shows that not only is the Articles of Confederation weak, but we don't really have any military that we can use to put down future rebellions. And we realize that we need to address these weaknesses. We need to make a stronger national government, and this leads to the Constitution Convention. So at the Constitutional Convention, we need to, as a nation, negotiate, create a new government, and fix all these weaknesses the Articles of Confederation had created. There's a few compromises that you should know when it comes to the Constitutional Convention. The biggest one is the Great Compromise. So this compromise is where we create this two-house legislature known as Congress. Big states wanted everything, representation to be based on population. Small states wanted some kind of equal representation. So what we see is this compromise will create the House of Representatives, which is based off population. So every 10 years, we have this census, we count population, and we redistribute representatives based on that. The other thing that we will create is the Senate. Each state will have 2 senators. So this way we can create this compromise where both small and large states will be happy. Another compromise was the 3/5 compromise over the issue of slavery and representation in the legislature as well. The Constitutional Convention will also allow the national government to collect taxes. It's going to allow them to have 3 branches of government. So we have that separation of powers. Legislative branch will make the laws, that's Congress. The executive branch carries out the laws, that's the president and vice president and the rest of the executive branch. And then the judicial branch will interpret laws. This is the Supreme Court. The Constitution will also create this concept of federalism, and I know a number of you in class have asked about federalism numerous times. So federalism is this division of power between state and federal governments. So you have these reserved powers, which are powers given to the states, such as education, delegated powers, powers given to the federal government, such as declarations of war. Concurrent powers are powers shared between the state and federal government, such as taxes. We pay federal taxes, we pay state taxes. And then there's denied powers, powers that neither state or federal government can do, such as suspension of habeas corpus, which we're going to see later on is actually going to be suspended by Abraham Lincoln, or titles of nobility, so no one can be a duke or a duchess. The Constitutional Convention also will help create in the Constitution a system of checks and balances. This is to ensure no one branch becomes too powerful. So the president can override a congressional veto. I'm sorry, let me repeat that. The president can veto a congressional legislation, but the Congress can override that. You also have this idea of popular sovereignty. You know, people have this final authority of power in the government. So popular sovereignty, popular rule. People can vote. And this elastic clause. And I know a lot of you in class had asked me as well about this elastic clause. So when you think elastic, it's flexible, it stretches. So this is also called the necessary and proper clause. This allows the Constitution to be able to stretch these powers. Anything that's necessary for the proper function and protection of the people can be carried out by Congress. And it's one of these ways that we can make our Constitution adapt over time. The Electoral College will also be established as a process to elect the president. So people don't directly elect the president. It's not based on popular vote. The Electoral College is essentially Congress. It's the senators and the House of Representatives, and they will vote typically according to the popular votes within their states. Whoever gets 270 electoral votes or more is then deemed the winner. Other terms or ideas that you should know when it comes to the Constitution is amendment process. This is the way in which we can add to the Constitution and change it. And to ratify means to approve. And once the Constitution was written, there needed to be some kind of process to ratify, the states to approve the Constitution. And this proved actually more difficult than many thought it would. So you have this argument developed between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And what we see is that Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson kind of become the faces of these movements. So Hamilton is a Federalist. So think federal government. They want a constitution. They want a stronger, more centralized government. And Hamilton and Madison and other men are going to write what becomes known as the Federalist Papers, a series of articles trying to convince people to pass the Constitution. Jefferson, on the other hand, he is an anti-federalist. He's against the federal government. He's against the Constitution. Jefferson and other anti-federalists were fearful. They thought that if they had too much of a concentrated power, that the president would become more like a monarch, and to be a similar issue as to what they saw under Great Britain. He believed that people needed to be protected, and in the end, another compromise will be established, and a Bill of Rights will be added to the Constitution to protect the rights of the people against tyranny, and to convince the holdouts, those states who were on the fence about ratifying the Constitution, to get on board. So once the Bill of Rights is added, that's that final compromise. And this is the first 10 amendments. The key ones that you should know is the First Amendment, which protects the people's right to practice religion or freedom from religion. It also protects your right to speech, your right to assemble, and for the freedom of the press. So the press can publish information that might be negative against the government. And this was all based on that colonial experience. As colonies, many colonists had these basic rights infringed upon by Great Britain. And so Thomas Jefferson and Anti-Federalists wanted to be certain that in the future, moving forward, United States citizens would be protected from that. There is a list online that you can easily find on the rest of the Bill of Rights if you're interested. Some of the other Bill of Rights that will come up later on when we start talking about like civil rights movement will be the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, as well as the Sixth. And so we'll review those a little bit further. But the First Amendment will come up more frequently and much faster. So our first president is going to be George Washington. And I know several of you had asked me about presidents and presidential decisions. I'm only going to focus on the presidents that you're most likely to see on the Regents, and I'm going to tell you the key points that you should know about them. So key points to know about George Washington is He sets a number of precedents. These are kind of rules that people are going to follow. And the biggest one is that 2-term limits for presidents. He had served 2 terms and then stepped down. This was a practice to be followed by presidents to come until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and following FDR. That's where this will become an actual law. So until then, this is a precedent set by George Washington. He also creates a cabinet. Those are his advisors. And that as well, nothing in the Constitution says that the president can create this system of advisors, but George Washington did, and that again becomes a precedent. Some of the issues that George Washington will face early on are issues such as, how are we going to pay off war debts? How are we going to raise money? And to deal with this, he nominates Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of Treasury. And he will task Alexander Hamilton with coming up with a financial plan in order to take care of these debt issues. So Alexander Hamilton's financial plan will create a tariff, this tax on foreign goods, these imports, to help raise money for the economy. He starts to tax whiskey as well. He also wants a national bank. This is based on that loose interpretation, or the necessary and proper clause. He's like, it's necessary and proper that we can create a bank that will manage federal funds. It can help us grow our economy. There's a highly controversial Anti-Federalists, such as Thomas Jefferson, were against this. They were concerned that this was given too much power to the federal government. Again, Jefferson was a strict constitutionalist. He's like, there's nothing in the Constitution that allows us to do this. Hamilton maintained that because of the elastic clause, that necessary and proper, it's a loose interpretation of the Constitution, they could in fact create this national bank, and the national bank will remain controversial throughout our early, critical years here. On George Washington's exit, he does give that farewell address, which we've looked at in class. He says, steer clear of permanent alliances. These alliances could impact us economically. It could impact us politically. We are young. We need to develop on our own. We also see that he encourages us to stay neutral, to stay out of foreign affairs. And he also warns against political parties. He's already seeing the controversies between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, and he's concerned that this could develop political parties in the U.S., which could then be detrimental to our political system. What we see is George Washington really was tasked with putting this new Constitution into play. And what we see is a number of traditions which are become part of this unwritten Constitution. It's not written in the Constitution, are going to be established. These are traditions, they're customs. There's nothing actually written in the Constitution in regards to this. But what we see is political parties do in fact emerge. The Federalist Party with Alexander Hamilton will be one of the first parties. Then you see that Jefferson has the Jeffersonian Democrats. These are democratic republics. These are like those Anti-Federalists are going to emerge. And we're going to see some of that controversy and some of the arguments continue. There's also going to be lobbying. Lobbying is this act of attempting to influence decisions made by officials in the government. And today, lobbyists can have millions of dollars back in them, and they will go into Congress and try to influence congressional members to try to get laws passed or prevent them from passing. And there's lobbyist groups, education. You might see medical industry. These are all special interest groups that will lobby. Okay. One of the probably biggest developments to come out of the new Constitution, out of Alexander Hamilton, and something that Washington needed to deal with, is this whiskey rebellion against the whiskey tax. I always joke in class about, Americans don't like it when you mess with their alcohol. We'll see a similar issue during Prohibition. But farmers are actually unhappy about this. This tax on whiskey makes it difficult and more expensive for people to sell whiskey. Farmers take extra grain that they had, and they would turn it into whiskey, which was more expensive, and they can make a little bit more money on it. But now with this tax, people are going to cut back, and it's going to cost farmers money. And George Washington, marches out on his white steed in front of this militia, and he puts down this rebellion. Ultimately the tax will be repealed, but we saw that not only did the president have the power, but he was willing to use his power to put down these rebellions. The second president of the United States is John Adams, and you might remember this XYZ affair that happened with France. France was demanding bribes from America in order for them to stop capturing U.S. ships and impressing U.S. sailors. We almost go to war, and Adams goes to Congress and tells them of this, bribe that is being demanded by France, and Congress doesn't believe him at all. So they're like, we need to see the letters proving this. So Adams changes the names of these French diplomats to X, Y, and Z, which is why it's called the XYZ affair, and brings it to Congress. Americans become outraged that France would demand money to stop capturing our ships. Almost leads to war, doesn't. We managed to stay out of it, but John Adams does pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is going to limit immigration. It's going to make it harder to become citizens if you are from another nation. Also, the Sedition Acts basically could allow people to be fined or jailed if they spoke out against the government. People who were not citizens that were here, who were arrested under the Sedition Act, could be kicked out of the U.S. And this is pretty controversial. Jefferson and his followers believed that this was unconstitutional and that Adams was merely passing this to try to get people to be quiet who were judging him and judging his administration. And what we see is that Jefferson and other individuals are behind the response to Alien Sedition Acts. And this response were the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So these two states create these acts of nullification. They try to nullify or cancel out the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what we see is this is the beginning of some of those debates over who's superior, the federal government or the state government. Do states have a right to nullify or cancel federal laws? The Supreme Court says they do not. They say that the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions do not hold any water. They don't have any power. But it was symbolic, and it shows that people are questioning federal law, and they are questioning whether or not states have more power than the federal government. But as we know, federal law is supreme. Later, after John Adams leaves his office, Thomas Jefferson becomes the third president, and he basically kind of rolls the Alien Sedition Acts back a little bit. During Thomas Jefferson's presidential tenure, we also see early on the Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison. This is a Supreme Court case that everyone should know. And as I've stressed in class, you don't need to know this in detail, but what you do need to know is that this Marbury versus Madison case establishes that power of judicial review. So judicial review, the judicial branch reviews laws. So Chief Justice John Marshall looks at this case, Marbury versus Madison, and he determines, that there's an aspect of this judicial act from previously that was unconstitutional. And this is the first time a law is deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and it creates this judicial review power and increases the power of the federal government, specifically the Supreme Court. So if you can remember Marbury versus Madison, judicial review, John Marshall, then you are going to easily get that multiple choice question, because those are usually like those three key terms that are linked together for that particular case. Another great thing to know from Thomas Jefferson's presidential tenure is this Louisiana Purchase. And I know we've talked about this quite a bit, but this is a good one to know for geography, U.S. expansion. You can also use Louisiana Purchase on an essay about presidential actions. So Thomas Jefferson, as we know, was a strict interpretationalist. He believed that if it's not written in the Constitution, you shouldn't do it. And the Louisiana Purchase was a case where he has to break from this strongly held belief of his. Originally he just wanted to buy the port of New Orleans from France so that we could get access to Mississippi River and up into the middle of the United States, the Great Plains, and eventually, hopefully, find like this Northwest Passage. And during negotiations, Napoleon offers the entire Louisiana Purchase. This would double the size of the United States overnight. No one would have to shed a drop of blood over it. And, obviously this would be a huge power move. So Jefferson was torn. Does he purchase this, which is an excellent opportunity for his people, or does he stick to his strict interpretationist beliefs and forego this, not do it, because he knows there's nothing explicitly in the Constitution that would give him this power. In the end, the Louisiana Purchase is going to be purchased from Napoleon for $15 million. Napoleon could then use this money for his own wars over in Europe. But the U.S. now has this huge chunk of land, and we don't know what's out there. Not until Lewis and Clark go and explore. Once they explore, we find out that there's tons of new fauna and flora, animals and plants that we hadn't been used to previously. This is going to jumpstart the interest into people moving west into the Great Plains. This is going to be where we start to see this push for like manifest destiny and U.S. expansion. The War of 1812 under President James Madison might pop up as a multiple choice question. Typically, you would need to know that this was by some considered like a second war of independence. We're fighting Great Britain. We are angry that the British were taking American sailors and forcing them to work on their ships. This is called impressment. The U.S. considered this a threat to the freedom of seas. We go to war with Great Britain. In the end, no one, really loses or gains territory. The British do officially pull out of the rest of the American territory that they had previously stayed in, despite the end of the Revolutionary War calling for them to move out of U.S. territory. And then we just continue on. The fifth president is James Monroe, and what you need to know about him is the Monroe Doctrine. So in this statement, the United States is going to tell Europe to stay out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. Basically this territory, is ours. If you come into this, if you threaten these new independent nations in Latin America, we are going to consider this a threat to U.S. security. We will take action against you. And the reason why we make this statement is these Latin American countries had just had revolutions and gained their independence from Spain, and we wanted to make sure that these countries stayed free and no one from Europe tried to come back in. We also wanted to make sure that we could keep Europeans out of this region so that we could build new economic relationships with these freed countries. At the time, the United States didn't have any power to really back the Monroe Doctrine. It was more like saber rattling. But luckily, Great Britain kind of backed it with us, and that kind of gave us a little bit more credit and a little bit more power behind our words. But following this newfound freedom of ours and this reestablishment of a government under the Constitution, then the start of expansion, we see that as we expand and as we increase our power, there's going to be more and more conflicts within the United States. And this is going to be because of all these changes taking place in what's called the antebellum era. This is before the Civil War. Our population is growing steadily. Our standard of living is increasing. We see that a cotton gin is invented by Eli Whitney, and this makes processing cotton a lot faster and cheaper, which will increase the demand for cotton, which then increases the demand for slavery. We have started to see a larger increase in the need for slaves and the workload that these slaves have to complete to keep up with this expansion and growth of our economy. We see that social mobility is starting to pick up as well. People are becoming wealthier. And what's really going to kickstart, a lot of this expansion and then what becomes known as sectionalism is transportation changes. We have the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad will link the United States. We get the Erie Canal, which I know many of you have asked me about as well. This canal is going to link the East Coast markets and cities to Midwest farmers. It's going to be cheaper to transport goods. And then this, of course, since it's cheaper, is going to increase the demand for these goods as well. And when we talk about expansion in the United States, the impact of geography, et cetera, the Transcontinental Railroad and the Erie Canal are great examples of this expansion, impact of geography that you could utilize for an essay. If you're interested in that, I do have materials I can get you on Monday for those as well. But what we see is that the United States is emerging as a very wealthy entity. We are becoming one of the most powerful countries in the world, as we move out of our infancy. But we are facing a lot of our own issues. The North and the South are very different. The South is agricultural, the North is industrial. And what we see is that we have these two very different sections or regions. As the North increases in their industry and factories, the South is pretty much staying the same. Cotton's king down there. And the South will be a little reluctant to change. Whereas in the North, people are getting into the industrialization. They're getting into all this new technology. And, people are starting to change not only economically, but, how they see society and what they expect from society. And this is going to lead to sectionalism, these differences between the North and the South that creates this conflict and this tension. And this will also lead to movements in the North to create societal change, these reform movements. So let's see. I'm going to talk a little bit more about sectionalism, and then I'm going to talk some about the Industrial Revolution, and I'll talk about reform movements as we lead into the progressive era. So I saw a lot of you who are asking about sectionalism. So remember, sectionalism, think sections. And what we see is conflicts are arising between the North and the South. Later, the West, as we close out the frontier and we establish states in the West, and we see more and more Americans moving into the West. They're coming from the North and the South. So then they move into the West, they bring these different ideologies, different ideas with them. And slavery is probably going to be one of the biggest conflicts that we see take place. And this will kind of play out in the West, because as we develop the West and these territories become states, there becomes a question of, will these new states be slave states? Or will they be free states and slavery will be illegal? We have abolitionists, many of which are in the North, but some in the South as well. They're trying to abolish slavery. They're moving out West and they're bringing these ideas with them. You also see farmers from the South moving West, trying to start new, trying to find cheap land thanks to like the Homestead Act, which will allow people to get land almost for free. You just set up a farm, you maintain that for a few years, you pay a few pennies per an acre to file paperwork, and bam, you have your own homestead. So along the East Coast, land was very limited and it was expensive. So these farmers, could move out West and start fresh. And they're going to bring with them this, idea of slavery and this need for slavery. And so this issue becomes not just a North-South issue, but also a West issue. But now, instead of being in two different regions, both of these groups of people are kind of butting heads in the West. So there's going to be a number of compromises made trying to prevent this conflict from becoming, a full-on war. Excuse me. So the first one is probably, the Compromise of 1850. We're trying to prevent a civil war. Slavery is the main issue that is dividing the nation. People are, hold resentment on both sides. In the North, they maintain that slavery is morally wrong. It's against Christian beliefs. In the South, they're like, hey, it's necessary for our way of life. We need slavery on these plantations to maintain, this kind of control, to continue to build our plantations and continue to farm, the cotton at the level that is needed. So with the Compromise of 1850, we see that we have all these new territories out west. We gain more land following the Mexican-American War. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo allows us to expand all the way to California, and we have all this new land. And we need to know, will California be admitted as a free state and when it becomes part of the U.S., or will it be a slave state? If it comes in as a free state, that means that the Senate will be divided and it will be unbalanced division. A lot of the South's concerns was maintaining this balance of power in Congress. So if each state has 2 senators and we have an equal number of states, well, we'll have an equal number of power. However, if one additional state comes in as a free state, now abolitionists will have more power in the Senate, which means they'll have more power to try to get laws passed, which will prevent the spread of slavery. So they have to compromise, come up with a deal. So what they decide is that California will in fact be a free state. The territories, otherwise, one from Mexico, will have popular sovereignty. Remember, popular sovereignty, popular rule. The people will vote, and they will vote on this issue of slavery. They also determined that slave trade will be banned in Washington, D.C. They will create a more strict fugitive slave law, which will make it easier to capture and bring back slaves to the South. And slavery, however, even though you can't trade within DC, you can still own slaves in DC. So this whole point was to try to maintain balance of power. But this compromise doesn't really kind of deal with this issue of slavery in the territories completely. It's still kind of unresolved. We know what we're doing with California. We know what we're doing with these new territories that we won from Mexico in the Mexican-American War, but we don't know what's going to happen to these other territories. Neither the South or the North were happy. We still don't know, again, what's going to happen in these other areas like Kansas and Nebraska. And that will just create more tension as these areas become more populated. So sectionalism is going to continue. Besides slavery, the South will also be nervous about tariffs. Again, these are taxes on imports. And in the South, since they're agricultural, they're agrarian, they have these large plantations, they have to import a lot of manufactured goods. And a tariff is going to make these manufactured goods more expensive for them to purchase. So it kind of bothers them. But on the other hand, these tariffs make goods from the North cheaper to purchase. So it really helps Northern businessmen. And people in the South are kind of resentful for this. They feel like Congress is benefiting these wealthy merchants and bankers in the North. They don't really care too much about, the farmers in the South. So that will be another point of contention for Southern people that will add to these conflicts of sectionalism. Besides the Compromise of 1850, we know it doesn't fix this issue. It doesn't help at all there's going to be a lot of conflict still. People are going to be kind of upset. They don't really know, how we're going to deal with this, and this is going to continue. And as people become kind of resentful, that look for other people that they feel like represent them, that speak for them. And one of these people is going to be Andrew Jackson, our 7th president. People see him as King Andrew, a champion of the common man. Some people argue that he abuses his power, but he also represents the common people. He was, not from a wealthy background. He is a self-made man. And so for people who see Congress and the government as not standing up for the common man, see Andrew Jackson as this hero. He comes into office, and he establishes, the spoils system. He gives all his loyal supporters government jobs. And he's like, to the victor goes the spoils. And this is a way that Jackson sees him increase in democracy. He's like, people who might not have had an opportunity because they didn't have the right family name or enough wealth now have access to these new government jobs. Andrew Jackson is also against the national bank. He's like, this is a question of federal versus state rights, but he believes that the bank is favoring wealthy merchants and bankers in the North. They're not helping farmers. So he decides to get rid of this bank, and he wants to make smaller state banks. And unfortunately, this move does lead to some economic, troubles for the nation. But some people view this as, this great move because he's given power to the states. But what Andrew Jackson is probably most known for is going to be, his actions regarding Native Americans. So there's 2 Supreme Court cases here that come into play, and that's the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia. So in the Cherokee Nation case, the Supreme Court rules that the Cherokee Nation are a sovereign nation. So then in the Worcester versus Georgia case, since this nation is a sovereign nation, the Supreme Court rules that American laws do not apply to Cherokee lands. And they basically rule that, if the Cherokee have a federal treaty with the United States, a state such as Georgia can't override that. Andrew Jackson is famously quoted as saying, "You've made your rule, now enforce it." We know the Supreme Court does not enforce rules. So this won't protect Cherokee at all. So Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Worcester versus Georgia, you see that Supreme Court upholds rights of the Cherokee, the own sovereignty of the Cherokee over their own lands. But in the end, since the president who enforces laws refuses to enforce this ruling, the Cherokee are going to be forced off their land. And in the Indian Removal Act, this act is going to force over 100,000 Native Americans from their homeland. This land tended to be fertile land that white settlers wanted. Andrew Jackson is going to maintain that this is best for the natives, to move them onto reservations where they can be with their own people and they can be protected. This leads to the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee, especially young and old, are going to perish. And this is a great concept to know well for an essay on presidential decisions. I know many of you did in fact use this on an essay earlier in the year. So if you can remember Andrew Jackson, Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, and then like Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Worcester versus Georgia, these are all great elements to remember for such an essay. So as these Native Americans are moved from their land, we see that westward expansion had continued to increase. The more westward expansion increases, the more conflicts we're going to have with Native American groups, the more sectionalism is going to occur between the North, the South, and the West in this argument over slavery. And ultimately, this is going to lead to more and more violent conflicts. Since the Compromise of 1850 failed to really deal with this issue of slavery, there's going to be another action taken. The Kansas-Nebraska Act will be established to try to deal with this idea of, how are we going to deal with these new states? Are they going to be free states or slave states? Well, Kansas-Nebraska Act establishes popular sovereignty. The people are going to vote. So once the people vote, that's going to be that. However, what we see is that people who are pro-slavery, people who are anti-slavery are going to flee into Kansas to try to take up residence, to become voters in Kansas so that they can vote on this issue. And this leads to the bleeding of Kansas. Many people consider this like a mini civil war. People are voting on slavery, and so these people there now actually clash. And there's going to be hundreds of people killed over this issue of slavery. Again, this continues. We also see John Brown occasionally comes up during this time period on the Regents. He was a militant, a violent abolitionist. He believed that if we armed slaves, they could start a revolt and we could end slavery in that manner. He raids Harper's Ferry to gain access to an arsenal and to collect weapons. He and many of his followers are caught, and he is convicted and hanged for his crimes. But this issue of slavery continues. Then we see the Dred Scott decision of 1857. So this is another Supreme Court case. So this is Dred Scott decision, and the Supreme Court decides slaves are property, not citizens. So in this case, Dred Scott was a slave who was taken to a free state. And once there, he tries to sue for his freedom. And he's like, I'm in a state in which slavery is illegal. Therefore, I should be freed. Supreme Court says, you are not a citizen. You are property. Therefore, you cannot sue. And just because you live in a free state does not mean you're free. So basically, this says that even if a state is free, if you purchase slaves elsewhere and then they're your property, you bring them to the free state and you could still keep them. Dred Scott decision also overturns the Missouri Compromise. This was an earlier compromise where it was stated that anything north of the 3630 line would be free. Anything below it would be slave, was unconstitutional. The Congress doesn't have a power to ban slavery. And so this Dred Scott decision essentially allows slavery to be created in all the territories, which obviously is going to make the North very upset. And it's going to increase sectional tension. This sectional tension will ultimately bubble up when we hit this election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, who was well known as being against slavery, although he wasn't necessarily pushing to abolish it, but he was against slavery, and he wins the election of 1860. And it's with that election that South Carolina is the first state to secede or break away from the United States. They were fearful that Abraham Lincoln would limit slavery, that they would affect the entire way of life in the South. And in the end, several other states joined South Carolina, and they formed the Confederacy and become known as the Confederate States of America. The president of the Confederacy is Jefferson Davis. President Lincoln doesn't want the country to divide. His goal was to preserve the Union, and he did not acknowledge the Confederate States of America as being an actual nation. It's like, you are a group of states in rebellion. You are not a legitimate government. And Lincoln would do anything in his power to preserve the Union, to reunite the United States and allow it to continue. And this essentially starts that Civil War. There are a number of factors that play into the strengths and weaknesses, but on the Regents, what you're really going to be tested on is going to be more of the outcome. So to get to the outcome, though, we have to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a military strategy, and a lot of people get confused with the Emancipation Proclamation because they know it frees slaves, but doesn't free all the slaves, and people get this confused all the time. So the Emancipation Proclamation is a document signed by Abraham Lincoln, and it frees the slaves in the Confederacy. So it only frees the slaves in the states in the South that have rebelled against the United States. There are a number of states called border states between the North and the South that had rebelled, and those people did not have this Emancipation Proclamation applied to them. These border states could still have slavery, although they did not agree with the Emancipation Proclamation. They were concerned that the Emancipation Proclamation would lead to a number of slaves fleeing from their masters and rushing these border states, which could create some race wars or tensions. But basically, this was used to make the focal point of the Civil War slavery. The South had been working with England and France, trying to get them to back the South. And if the United States made it clear that we were fighting to end slavery, British and French would not back the South. Britain and France had already banned slavery, and there's no way they would have backed the South and fought with the South against the United States of America if we, the United States of America, was fighting to end slavery. So that was a military strategy. Lincoln used this basically to prevent the South from gaining access to troops that they needed from England and France, but also it would deny them the labor, those slaves that were able to escape, that they needed to continue the war effort. Symbolically, it is clear the Civil War was now about slavery. It's not just about preserving the Union. And this is going to encourage free Black men and abolitionists in the North to join the war efforts. Other issues from the Civil War you should be aware of, and this is great for an essay on presidential actions, but takes a number of steps which significantly increases the power of the president. And this ties into that idea that in times of crisis, the power of the president grows or increases. So if you remember earlier, I said that in the Constitution, the right of habeas corpus cannot be denied to American citizens, but Abraham Lincoln does suspend habeas corpus. By suspending habeas corpus, President Lincoln is able to indefinitely detain anyone he believes to be a sympathizer with the Confederacy. He also ends freedom of the press. Anything that criticized the war effort could not be printed. He creates a draft to try to get more soldiers to fight in the war. And he institutes an income tax to pay for this war. So these are all steps he takes that increases the power of the president and are very controversial. Ultimately, what we see is that the war is going to come to an end. The South, has been devastated through this idea of total war. Large areas of the South have been destroyed. Bridges have been blown up. Railroads torn up. Farms destroyed. General Sherman had marched through Georgia all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, burning everything in his path. So the war is over, but for many, there's nothing to go home to. 1 in 5 white men have been killed in the Civil War. It's the bloodiest war in U.S. history. The transportation in the South has been destroyed. Countless civilians have died. There's also shortages of food. Now you also have all these slaves that are going to be freed by the 13th Amendment that are going to need education and jobs, places to live. And we need to figure out, how are we going to deal with this? And this is where we entered this period of Reconstruction. We need to reconstruct or rebuild the South. How are we going to do that? How are we going to deal with all these issues? How are we going to readmit the Confederate states who back into the United States so that we are one nation again? These are all issues that need to be dealt with during Reconstruction. And there's going to be a couple different plans for Reconstruction that you should be aware of. And the first one is Lincoln's plan. It's also known as the 10% plan. He is backed by his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee, so he wanted to go easy on the South, just like Lincoln did. Lincoln returns this idea of reuniting the Union. He's like, I want to be lenient. I want to forgive all the Southerners. They should take a loyalty oath. But only 10% of them need to do that. And that's where this becomes known as the 10% plan. 10% of the people in the South take a loyalty oath to the United States. They support the United States Constitution. They obey the anti-slavery laws. And you know what? You can be readmitted and we can move on and rebuild. But Republicans in Congress, known as radical Republicans, like, no, not going to happen. Many of these people are abolitionists and they want the South to pay. Radical Republicans come up with the Reconstruction Act. This act is harsh. They want to punish the South. They believe Lincoln is too lenient, and they do not agree with him. Unfortunately for Lincoln, he is assassinated, and Vice President Johnson will become the president. And President Johnson is going to clash with the Republicans a lot on Reconstruction, so much that the radical Republicans tried to impeach him. That's the process by which we can remove a president from power. He is brought up on impeachment charges. They're one vote shy of actually removing him from office, but because the radical Republicans had so much power, their plan is going to move forward. This Reconstruction plan will require that a majority of the voters must take an oath of loyalty in order to be readmitted. Each individual state had to outlaw slavery. It wasn't enough that they abide by the 13th Amendment, which had been added to the Constitution to end slavery, but they had to outlaw slavery in their own states as well. Any Confederate officer of high rank would also lose their right to vote. Since radical Republicans controlled most of Congress, it was easy for them to pass these legislations, and they also put the South under martial law. For years, the United States military would rule over the South in military districts created under the Military Reconstruction Act. During Reconstruction, there are going to be several civil rights acts passed. The South had passed black codes trying to prevent freed slaves from having any rights. And Congress will create the Civil Rights Act to overrule these black codes. The 13th Amendment will end slavery. The 14th Amendment gives equal rights to blacks. They become citizens. And the 15th Amendment gives blacks the right to vote. These become known as the Reconstruction Amendment. So 13th ends slavery. 14th makes former slaves citizens. And 15th gave blacks the right to vote. Obviously, this is going to be short-lived because once Reconstruction comes to an end, the South will pass a series of laws called Jim Crow laws. They are extremely racist laws. They create segregation amongst other highly restrictive laws for blacks in the community. And what we see is that many of these slaves that are no longer enslaved are going to have many of their rights limited. Many of them, because of lack of education and funds, will stay on their former master's lands as sharecroppers. This leads to them being repressed still, living in extreme poverty. As sharecroppers, basically they had to give a share of their crops to the landowner, but they also had to pay a share of the crops to rent tools. And so in the end, there really wasn't much left over for these African Americans. We also see that there'll be a rise in the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. There's a white supremacy organization. They use fear to try to intimidate blacks or anyone who would try to help blacks. A number of laws will be passed to prevent blacks from voting, such as a literacy test. You need to be able to read and write to vote, or the poll tax. You need to pay tax to vote. But of course, there's a lot of poor white men in the South. I say white men because women still cannot vote. And these poor white men typically couldn't afford the poll tax, and they typically were illiterate as well. So the grandfather clause would be passed, which would allow you to vote if your grandfather could have voted before slavery was ended. So this basically will allow the poor white Southerners to work around and not have to pay a tax or have to pass a literacy test. A couple other terms that you should know as far as Reconstruction, because that was one of the items on the list of things you wanted me to cover, is scallywags. These are names for white Southern Republicans. They tended to vote with Northern Republicans. Carpetbaggers were Northern Republicans who moved to the South not only to make money, but to influence politics. The Solid South is a term used to refer to the Democratic voters in the South. The Democrats tended to have a very strong hold on the South. And sharecrop is another one that comes up. Landowners allows a tenant to use the land in return for a share of the crop produced on the land. And again, it leaves these sharecroppers in a situation where they're extremely poor. Reconstruction ends with the Compromise of 1877. The compromise over the disputed presidential election is that Republican Hayes will become president instead of the Democrat, and troops will be removed from the South, ending military occupation and bringing Reconstruction to an end. The South is still going to have areas devastated from the war. They're still going to have trouble rebuilding. But what we see is following the period after Reconstruction, we enter what becomes known as the Gilded Age. So if you remember, the Gilded Age is this, time where people looking outside at the United States thinks we look very prosperous. There's big business. There's people with extreme amounts of wealth. But underneath it all, we're still very poor, and there's a lot of corruption. Big businesses are making a lot of money. But many of these leaders, such as Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, are seen as, robber barons. They're using ruthless measures to cut out other businesses, to get rid of competition so that they can make tons of money, for them to, take advantage of their workers. But other people saw them as captains of industry. They were able to turn enterprises into million-dollar industries. They also give a lot back to their communities. They build libraries. They donate to colleges. But what we see is there's a lot of issues. At this time, there is a practice of laissez-faire, lazy government. The government is hands off. They don't put any regulations on businesses, which really allows a lot of corruption to develop. People start to organize into unions, such as the Knights of Labor or the AFL. They're trying to strike and boycott to try to prevent workers from being taken advantage of. But what we see is, these strikes, such as the Homestead strike, the railroad strike, Pullman strike, the Haymarket riot, these all lead to violence and some clashes with the police and sometimes even the National Guard. The government was not very supportive of unions early on. But eventually that's going to change. We're going to see more people like muckrakers, those investigative journalists, and also political leaders such as William Jennings Bryan are going to step forward in an attempt to help the everyday worker, farmers, laborers. A couple of political parties will emerge, such as the Grangers. So Grangers, think Grange. These are farmers who ask the government to, take over the railroad so that they can set railroad prices. So railroad companies couldn't take advantage of poor farmers by charging them, enormous fees for their services. The Populist Party will help fight for farmers and laborers. One of their famous presidential candidates is William Jennings Bryan. You might remember Bryan from when we did our activity on the Wizard of Oz. He was a proponent or supporter of the silver standard. He wanted the U.S. to use silver and gold to back the U.S. economy, to be behind the U.S. dollar. And he and many populists believed that if there was more money in circulation, this would help poor farmers be able to pay off loans and stabilize. But what could happen with the silver standard, or a bimetallic standard where we use gold and silver, is this could cause inflation and in the end really not help. But what we see during the Gilded Age is lots of immigration. A lot of people are moving from North and Central Europe, places like Ireland because of the Irish potato famine. You also see lots of Chinese workers and Japanese workers. The U.S. will start to take action to limit immigration because of strong anti-immigration feelings. Nativists, people who are like white Americans, believe that immigrants were beneath them. The Chinese Exclusion Act would stop the Chinese from coming into America, even though the Chinese helped build our railroads. The Gentlemen's Agreement would limit immigration from Japan. No new male workers from Japan could come. But if you had already established yourself in the United States, you could send for your family. We also see corrupt political machines become established during this Gilded Age. So it's not just big businesses taking advantage of people, but corrupt politicians such as Boss Tweed. They control cities. Like Boss Tweed was in New York City. He bribes people. He stole millions from taxpayers. They create these unnecessary government jobs to award people. They create construction bids where they can charge over crazy prices to the state to be able to cover these costs and then pocket the difference. And all this is going to lead to an increase of demands to reform society. And this brings us into that progressive era, that progressive movement, where they want to respond to these problems from the Gilded Age, from industrialization, and fix society. So a lot of people were unaware of the extent or the massive problems in the United States. And it was up to progressives to inform them. So you have muckrakers, they rake up the muck, they uncover all these terrible things in society, start to write newspaper articles and books telling the story of America and how crazy it is. They want to improve safety and working conditions. They want to outlaw child labor. We want to create programs for people who are sick and unemployed. We want to reduce government corruption. We want women to earn the right to vote. We want to address racial segregation and issues facing African Americans. We want to address alcoholism. All these are things that progressives want to change. And to do this, they will organize in groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. They'll make demands, so they'll lobby the government for demands. They'll put pressure on the government, and they'll publicize results. They'll write articles about what they're able to accomplish change in. So reform movements is a very popular essay topic you might see on the Regents. So some of the big ones is reform for alcohol. And you guys might have remembered hearing, I said briefly, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. Let me find my notes so I can make sure I don't leave anything out. Okay, so Women's Christian Temperance Movement are trying to ban the sale and buying of alcohol. They believe that all the problems in society stem from Alcoholism. Men spend all their money at the bar, so their families are poor. They come home drunk, and then they beat their wives and children. Or maybe there's infidelity. They cheat on their wives because of alcohol. So this women Christian temperance movement is an abstinence movement. They're trying to ban alcohol. Carrie Nation is probably one of the most prominent leaders. She was often depicted holding a hatchet in her Bible because she would run into bars with her hatchet and crack open all the barrels of alcohol and spill them on the floor. And these people are actually successful. They lobby the government and put pressure on the government and are able to get Congress to pass the 18th Amendment, which bans the sale of alcohol. Ironically, this ban will continue through the 1920s. And since I know you guys read The Great Gatsby for English, the 20s is this, the roaring 20s. People are partying, they're drinking alcohol. We see an increase in crime as people bootleg and smuggle alcohol into the United States. So alcoholism does drop a little bit, but it doesn't stop anyone from continuing to drink. But it does create organized crime, like, these gangs that will help bring alcohol in. You get speakeasies where people, go to these secret bars and they drink. And the prohibition, as it's called, will continue into the early 30s until the 21st Amendment overturns prohibition. In a way that you can remember this, because this is a good topic to talk about for amendments, if you have an essay on Supreme Court decisions and talk about how, I'm sorry, not Supreme Court decisions, constitutional amendments, you talk about how the Constitution is flexible, how they can change it. 18th Amendment bans the sale of alcohol. It's illegal for you to drink when you're 18. So 18th Amendment, illegal to drink and sell alcohol. At the age of 18, you can't drink. So you remember that 18th Amendment. 21st Amendment. So when you're 21, you can legally drink. The 21st Amendment overturns prohibition and makes the buying and selling of alcohol legal once again. So that's a good amendment essay to kind of remember. The women's reform movement also picks up during this progressive era. Before the Civil War, women had met at Seneca Falls in upstate New York. Convention, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony. And here they discuss that women should have the same rights as men. And they come up with this Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. Like, women should have the same rights as men. And they borrow language from the Declaration of Independence and, talk about, all, men and women should be created equal, etc. But when the Civil War happens, we focus so much on abolition that women's rights gets put on the back burner until, we get back into the progressive era. And it's during the progressive era that women reorganize again, and they start to experience these new kind of freedoms. Because industrialization has picked up, there's a need for more labor, more women begin to work. They start to want access to education and professional jobs. They want equal pay. And demands for these equalities started to grow. Technology starts to change women's lives. They have more freedoms, more access, to these educational opportunities. And they are going to push for their right to vote. They want suffrage. And this is going to be an ongoing battle. I know any of you who've come to some of my after school review, the women's rights movement is a great one to know for civil rights. You could also know this one for an amendment, because it's the 19th Amendment that gives women the right to vote. These women will organize. They will protest outside the White House. There's a group called the Silent Sentinels that will stand outside the White House with signs demanding that President Wilson give them the right to vote. These women are arrested. They're imprisoned. And in prison, they go on a hunger strike and they refuse to eat. Prison officials will force feed these women. And the process is very gruesome and can do a lot of damage to the esophagus and stomach. And newspaper writers will write about the treatment of these women. And Americans become outraged that their daughters, their wives, their sisters are being treated this way. And ultimately, it's this pressure that convinces Congress to pass the 19th Amendment in 1920 that gives women the right to vote. So that's a great topic to know well, because you can do that for a civil rights movement for women. You can also use that for an amendment essay. Okay. Another movement that we see will be for Blacks in the United States. So after the Black Codes, we had Jim Crow laws. It prevented Blacks from voting thanks to the poll tax and literacy literacy tests that they had to take. Another Supreme Court case that dealt with Blacks was Plessy versus Ferguson. This is one I always tell you guys to know well. If you know Plessy versus Ferguson well, you can use this for civil rights as well. Plessy refused to sit on the Jim Crow cart. He is part Black, and he sues. And it's here that the Supreme Court rules in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal is constitutional. And this sets up a basis for legal segregation throughout the United States. This does not set well with Blacks in America or people who had been abolitionists. And you see a number of organizations form during the Progressive era to try to help African Americans and other minorities. So you have the NAACP, that's the National Association of the Advancement of Color People. You also see key civil rights advocates such as Booker T. Washington. You know, he wants to create a system where African Americans can learn trades or skills, and he creates the Tuskegee Institute. You also have W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a middle-class, highly educated African American who believed that Blacks should get equality immediately and that they should receive higher education. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were like, you know, two different sides of the same coin. They both wanted equality for African Americans in America, but they saw different ways to achieve it. And the struggle for equality for Blacks will continue in, you know, into where we hit the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Some key people that you should know from the progressive movement, these muckrakers. You know, they rake up the muck. They uncover all these issues. You know, these are people like Jacob Riis. He wrote the book, How the Other Half Lives. There are images of how people lived in the tenements of New York City, and it allows the reader to just see how the other half, these, you know, poor individuals, lived in the United States. Ida Tarbell was a muckraker. She exposed monopolies in her book, The History of the Standard Oil Company. Her father had worked for the Standard Oil Company and had lost his job. So this was like a personal vendetta for her to uncover all those terrible practices the Standard Oil Company utilized to chase out competition. Upton Sinclair is going to influence Theodore Roosevelt, our president, and the federal government to pass legislation in his book, The Jungle. The Jungle was about this immigrant family, but this one chapter about the meatpacking plant in Chicago really just turned people off. You know, they talked about how rotten meat could be filled with chemicals to change its color and its smell so that people wouldn't realize. You know, it talked about, you know, rats getting mixed in with the meat as well. And all of this really concerned Americans who had been buying meat and had no idea what they were getting. And this inspired, you know, the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. So now Pure Food and Drug Act, you know, whatever we purchase needs to be clearly labeled. We know what we're buying. It also creates the Meat Inspection Act, which requires meat to be inspected and approved by the USDA before it could be sold. You know, so those are some of the key muckrakers that you should know for the Regents. A number of reforms are going to be created to address political corruption. You have the initiative allows voters to petition for laws or bills. The referendum allows voters to vote on you know, legislation when it's being passed. So I always talk about in class, a couple of years ago, there was a referendum in New York on whether or not we are going to allow casinos. People in New York got to vote on that. There's also a recall. If you have an elected representative who is corrupt or they're not doing their job, you can recall them by voting to have them removed from office. We also have a direct primary now. This means that voters select candidates to run for office. You don't have, the heads of parties electing these people. U.S. citizens now, during primary season, vote for who they want to be their candidate. We also ensure, that citizens can cast votes without being influenced, because now we have secret ballots. No one knows how you're voting. So you can't be threatened or encouraged to vote a certain way, because no one knows how you voted. You can do what you want. Some other acts or legislations you might want to keep in mind during the Progressive Era is the Sherman Antitrust Act or the Clayton Antitrust Act. Anything that's anti is against. So antitrust means they're against trust. So these are these business trusts, like these monopolies, these large organizations that will control all aspects of a company or an industry, which gets rid of competition. So the antitrust acts are going to make it illegal to have monopolies in an attempt to increase competition. We also see that because of the spoils system practiced by Andrew Jackson and others, there were people in these government positions who were incompetent. They couldn't do their job or they're corrupt. So we create the Pendleton Civil Service Act. It requires that you take a test to become a government employee. So if you want to work for the post office, if you want to be a police officer, you need to take and pass a test. We also see that there's a lot of environmental damage done during expansion and for industry. So we have the U.S. Forest Service established to manage our water and timber. Theodore Roosevelt was one of these progressive presidents. He was very much into conserving land for future generations. And he's going to be responsible for a lot of our national parks being created. And he's going to push for, this conservation, this protection of lands to take place. So Theodore Roosevelt is the first of 3 progressive presidents. And, he is going to support conservation. He supported the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act. He went after railroad companies. He promoted fair labor practices. He also supported collective bargaining, where workers and bosses work together to come up with deals that they could all agree to. So he is pretty progressive. He believed in this idea of a square deal. The square deal was his domestic, policy. He wants to help workers. He wants to help farmers. He wants it to be fair. William Howard Taft is going to be the second progressive president. He is going to support the 16th Amendment, which allows Congress to create an income tax. He goes after big businesses as well. These guys are known as trust busters. They bust up these trusts. He goes after the Standard Oil Company as well. And then the third progressive president is Woodrow Wilson. Wilson became president, kind of out of luck. Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were both Republican. Teddy Roosevelt, as Theodore was known, did not agree with what the Republican Party had started to do and had hoped to run as a Republican, but he didn't get the nomination for the Republican Party. So he created a third party, the Bull Moose. And Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson are going to go up together. And Theodore Roosevelt and Taft split this Republican vote. And because of that, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, will be elected president. He has only about 40% of the vote. So had Theodore Roosevelt not run, the Republicans would have had about 60% and they would have won. But instead, Woodrow Wilson becomes president. He comes up with this idea of this new freedom. It was this progressive idea. He wants to improve distribution of money. He wants to make sure that there's an adequate money supply. So he creates the Federal Reserve System. The Fed, as it's called, is basically regulates circulation of money. They'll also control base interest rates, trying to prevent massive inflation from happening. Woodrow Wilson, again, will be president when women gain the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. But unfortunately, he's also going to kind of be sucked into this, era of imperialism in World War I. So there's a lot of reasons the U.S. becomes imperialistic. And, if some of you are wondering how much longer this is going to last, I'll probably only go to about 4 o'clock. I think probably get through maybe the world wars, and then we'll pause. And tomorrow after school, I'll continue with the rest of this. Hopefully I can figure out how to get this actual video, because I know you all want to look at my beautiful face here. So there are many reasons why the United States decides to enter this imperialistic, game, so to speak. It's the end of the 19th century, so this is the 1800s. We've closed the frontier. Like, the middle of the United States has essentially been conquered. Native Americans have been pushed onto reservations. We've established all these new states. We've fulfilled this manifest destiny, this expansion, right? This, God gave us the power so we could expand from coast to coast. And now we're looking outside our coastal areas. We had this idea that we would spread religion and democracy, but because of industrialization, we also need new markets. We are motivated economically to become imperialistic. So we need colonies to be able to really continue to compete with other imperialistic nations. We need new trade opportunities. If we want to be a real world power, we need naval bases and we need colonies. It's our destiny. We're going to continue this idea of manifest destiny. It's our destiny to expand. We have this responsibility to care for the poor and weak people. If we have, territories and then we decide to abandon them, it'd make us appear weak. So we have to make sure we're on our game. And as we do this, we can spread our ideas of liberty and democracy. But not everyone in the U.S. agreed with this idea of imperialism. Having a massive empire is expensive. It can be a financial burden. We really need to concentrate on our issues at home. I mean, this is the late 1800s. This is going on at the same time as industrialization, at the same time as the progressive movement. And, much like you hear debates today, why are we going to continue to look outside our borders and invest money in other areas when people in the United States are suffering? There's a lot of racism as well. People are ethnocentric. They see, Americans as being better. So they're like, why do we want to go out into other regions as well? Some people argue that it's a violation of our democratic principles to annex land or to conquer other lands. Like, we, the United States, had fought Great Britain for freedom. How could we then justify going out and conquering other people? And in general, people are like, it's just going to be too expensive. But what we see is we really are encouraged by a number of people that this is the only opportunity. The Western frontier is closing. We need new raw materials, new markets. European nations are already competing with each other for resources and markets. And if we want to compete with Europeans, we must do this. And what sparks U.S. imperialism is the Spanish-American War. So if you remember, we had businesses invested in Cuba. Millions of dollars, U.S. dollars, were invested in Cuba, and Spain had controlled Cuba. Cuba had been treated poorly by Spain, but there still wasn't enough support for the war at home. So yellow journalism is going to be instituted, where newspapers are going to publish political cartoons and stories to try to encourage American support for war with Spain. So think about the sinking of the USS Maine. So the USS Maine is a ship off the coast of Havana, Cuba. It gets sunk. Newspapers and everyone points a finger at Spain. Next thing you know, we are fighting Spain in the Spanish-American War. In the end, the U.S. defeats Spain, and we get their former territories. Cuba is given their independence with some U.S. influence. The U.S. maintains Puerto Rico. We maintain Guam. And for a while, we kept the Philippines until a bloody war with the Philippines gains Philippine independence for them as well. But the effects of the Spanish-American War is what's important. We have developed this massive navy known as the Great White Fleet. We are able then to encourage an open door policy with China so we can get access to those millions of people in China to sell goods to. Our new lands that we've acquired in the Caribbean and the Pacific makes us an imperialistic nation. These are our early colonies. Because we have these colonies in the Pacific and in the Caribbean island, we now want a way to get there faster. We would have to go all the way around South America to get to the Pacific from the East Coast or the Gulf of Mexico. So the U.S. is going to encourage Panama to start a war for independence from Colombia so that Panama can gain independence, and then in return, the U.S. could get the Panama Canal. After many years, the U.S. has built the Panama Canal, and we're now able to use the Panama Canal to send troops to our new military bases and protect our trade networks throughout the Pacific. And now we are going to further our influence in Latin America. And if you remember from Global, imperialism is going to be one of the main causes of World War I. So nations had been building up their armies all over Europe. Alliances were being formed. You have the Central Powers, which is like Germany and the Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. You have the Allies, Britain, France, and later the United States. Nationalism. All these ethnic groups want independence, but also all these imperialistic nations are extremely nationalistic. Of course, imperialism. Empires are competing with each other for land. This is going to create a lot of tension. And then the last spark to start World War I is that assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. So if you remember from Global, we call this mania, right? Militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and finally the assassination. So initially, the U.S. followed a traditional foreign policy of neutrality. George Washington said we should remain neutral, and we had been attempting to do so. We believe that if we join the war, it would weaken our independence. We want to continue to trade with European countries. We want to protect foreign investments. We just did not want to get involved. However, by 1917, we needed to get involved, and this is sometimes called the boat in the note, right? So we get the sinking of the Lusitania. So this is a British ship. There's about 400 Americans on board. Germany attacks and torpedoes this ship, sinking it off the coast of Ireland. Thousands of people die, including a few hundred Americans, and Americans are livid. This was called unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany maintained if you were in waters around the conflict area, you are a target. And the U.S. saw this as a threat to the freedom of the seas. And then the note, the Zimmerman note or Zimmerman telegram. Basically, this note is intercepted from Germany to Mexico. Mexico never got it, but Germany was trying to convince Mexico to attack the U.S. in return for all the territory they lost in the Mexican-American War, should the U.S. attempt to get involved in the war effort. This was printed in newspapers. American citizens were angry, and ultimately we will get pulled into the war. During the war, President Wilson really wanted to push for a plan called the 14 points, Wilson's 14 points, to prevent future wars. His main point was he wants to create a League of Nations. All the nations of the world will come together, will solve our problems, and will prevent more war. Unfortunately, the U.S. doesn't enter the League of Nations. The Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles that the League of Nations was a part of. They refuse to sign it. We're like, first of all, you're too harsh on Germany. We don't want to get involved in any more alliances, so we're not joining the League of Nations. And this really weakens the League of Nations, and it's going to put the League in a position where they can't really enforce anything. But during this time period, there's a lot of controversy at home. We need, in the United States, soldiers. So the Selective Service Act is passed by Congress. This institutes a draft. We create a total war. All our resources are going towards the war effort. Men go off to fight. Women go to work in factories. We start to see the government increase our power over the economy. They control prices. They enact rations, similar to what we see in World War II. And people openly criticize this. And one of these people is a gentleman called Schenck. He was against the draft. He's anti-war, and he was creating pamphlets encouraging people who had been drafted to not sign up for their duty. He is arrested under the Espionage Act. He is trying to, threaten the war effort. And so the U.S. really increases their power of the government by putting these limits on the free speech. And this is a good Supreme Court case to know. So in Schenck versus the U.S., the Supreme Court rules that your freedom of speech is not absolute. He is creating a clear and present danger for the United States. He is undermining the war effort. He is encouraging people to not help in the war effort. This is a threat to national security, and he is convicted and goes to jail for this. So one of these big ideas that comes out of this time period is this idea, once again, that in times of crisis, civil liberties are restricted. We saw it with Abraham Lincoln with habeas corpus in the Civil War, and we see it with Wilson in World War I with the Espionage Act and the Supreme Court case Schenck versus U.S. Those are two good ones to remember. We've done some essays on them. And then the third one that's really good that we're going to be looking at next, and that's probably the last thing we'll do, is going to be World War II, when FDR allows for the internment of Japanese citizens. So World War I comes to an end. Germany is blamed. The Treaty of Versailles, which ends the war, also forces Germany and Russia to lose land. Germany has to pay massive reparations. These are repayments. And they try to incorporate some of Wilson's 14 points, but not all of them. And again, since the U.S. doesn't join the League of Nations, we don't prevent another war from happening. Okay. So I'm going to skip the 20s and the Great Depression a little bit, just so I can talk about World War II, and then we'll go back tomorrow to that. So I just want to talk about World War II because I want to focus on this, how it's similar to World War I, and we have done some essay work on this. So World War II, again, many of the same causes from World War I. Germany, is in this economic crisis, and it allows Hitler to become the fascist leader, the Nazi Party, and he rises up. Similar situation in Italy. Mussolini rises up during this economic depression, creates a fascist government, and they ally with Japan, and that's the Axis powers. The allied powers are going to be Britain, France, Russia, and America. Again, we try to remain neutral. We try to remain isolated at the start of World War II, but it just doesn't stick. The neutrality acts are passed. They're designed to try to keep us isolated, prevent us from being drawn into the war, but we develop a cash and carry policy. U.S. businesses are given permission to sell products to nations at war as long as they could pay in cash, and they use their own ships to transport these products across the ocean. Then FDR supports a lend-lease policy. FDR describes this as making the U.S. an arsenal of democracy. We could supply weapons and equipment to the Allies, and in return, we could lease bases, military bases from them, which is why we have military bases all over today. So we see that we're shifting from neutrality to really starting to get involved and kind of favor one side over another. But it's not until Japan attacks Pearl Harbor in Hawaii that the U.S. enters. This is December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy. It's one of the few times in our history that U.S. soil has actually been attacked. Japan saw our fleet in the Pacific in Hawaii as being a threat. And they thought that had they attacked and destroyed this fleet, the U.S. would kind of back down and not get involved in the war. But what we see is that on the following day, the U.S. declares war on the Axis powers, and we enter on the side of the Allies. A major turning point is going to be D-Day. This is where we invade France with other allies and start to push Germany back out of France. D-Day, what we see is, some of the worst fighting. It's a turning point, though, and Germany starts to have to move back. Ultimately, Germany will be defeated, and we are then going to focus on Japan. But before we talk about Japan so much, I want to talk about FDR. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of fear in the United States that the Japanese had spies within the United States. And so FDR authorizes an executive order to relocate Japanese Americans to internment camps. People are afraid that they are trying to sabotage America. They might be spying. This is Executive Order 9066. And Japanese Americans are going to be relocated, over 100,000 of them. Some of these locations are guarded heavily, some less so. But again, this is a time that in times of crisis, civil liberties are suspended. Once again, we have a president suspending civil liberties for a group of Americans. So, Abraham Lincoln, habeas corpus civil war. Woodrow Wilson, freedom of speech with the Espionage Act, World War I. Now, FDR threatened civil liberties by relocation of Japanese Americans in World War II. It's not until many years later, about 40 years later in the 80s, that there's an apology given for this movement. Some of you might remember the video I showed in class on George Takei, talking about his experience in these internment camps. World War II ultimately comes to an end, though, in Japan when the U.S. drops an atomic bomb, first on Hiroshima, then on Nagasaki, and following, Japan surrenders. There are many reasons why this was dropped. Some of them might be to end the war quickly, to save money. This would make an invasion unnecessary and would save soldiers' lives. And it pretty much instantly marks the U.S. as the most powerful nation in the world. So some people argue that dropping the atomic bomb was also a demonstration of power to the Soviets, who also were starting to emerge as a major power in the world. Of course, the end of World War II also kind of brings into light more of the genocide and anti-Semitism that had occurred in Germany and their territories during the Holocaust. Many of you might remember, over 6 million Jews and 6 million other ethnicities were killed by Hitler in Germany. Germany had blamed Jews for economic depression and many other problems in Germany, which made them the scapegoat. But what's really important here for American history is the Nuremberg trials. So after the Holocaust, top Nazi leaders are put on trial for their crimes against humanity. And it's at the Nuremberg trials that many of these people were found guilty and executed for their crimes. And this showed the world that, you could be and would be held accountable for your actions in times of war, and, made a major mark on history. So, because it's almost 4 o'clock, I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of the Great Depression and how World War II pulled us out of it. And I'll kind of end there for the day. And then tomorrow I can do this again, hopefully get my camera to work. So during the Roaring 20s, there's a big economic boom. The economy was doing well. There's a lot of people purchasing things with credit cards or installment plans. You pay over an extended period of time. But we also see following World War I that there's this Red Scare. People have responded to the Russian Revolution and the increase in communism. We are afraid in America that these immigrants are bringing communists over, and this increases anti-immigration in America. You might remember the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, these Italian immigrants convicted without evidence and executed because they were anarchists and communist sympathizers. And, this is, kind of the start of what will lead into the Cold War and this fear of communism at home. But in the 20s, women's roles have started to change. During World War I, many of them have worked outside the home. They're starting to break away from like these social, beliefs. They're wearing makeup. They're cutting their hair short. Flappers are wearing revealing clothing. That women are starting to enter professional jobs. Women now have the right to vote in 1920. We also see during this time that people in general are starting to kind of change. There is a great migration where thousands of African Americans move up into the north looking for work. Suburbs, start to grow a little bit as troops return from World War I looking for work. You see people start to move away from religion. You have the Scopes monkey trial where they talk about should they teach evolution or creationism. The science teacher taught theory of evolution, and they had outlawed these teachings. The Ku Klux Klan is going to start to become more powerful. It's like their second rising. You have the Harlem Renaissance from all these African Americans moving up into the north. Harlem, New York, a resurgence of African American art, literature, and music. Even white individuals are interested in Black music. They go to clubs. People start to go to the movies. Hollywood becomes popular. Newspapers, mass media. People are listening to the radio. Again, prohibition's going on during this time, but it doesn't stop people from partying. But then the Great Depression hits. So the Great Depression is a severe economic slowdown. People had invested in the stock market, but when profits declined, they had lost money. Some people had bought stocks on margin, which is kind of like on credit. Like you give them a little bit to buy the stocks, and then when the stocks raise in price, you sell it, and then you would pay back what you owed. But when the stock market crashed, you were still in debt. And what we see is this creates this chain reaction. The stock market crashes in 1929. This Great Depression begins because people have been buying on with credit. There's a massive unequal distribution of wealth, so a huge gap between rich and poor. They're overproducing items. People aren't buying as much. There's just a lot of issues going on in America. The Dust Bowl had created, issues with growing of food in the Midwest. There was a drought. Then the Dust Bowl, topsoil is disappearing. Animals are dying. Food couldn't be developed. Farmers were, already had a difficult time in the early 1900s, even harder time. President Hoover basically was like, there's nothing wrong. He's like, business is fine. They're going to recover. He supported laissez-faire economic policies. And as people lost their homes, they moved into what they call Hoovervilles to poke fun at President Hoover. So like these shacks built by the homeless all over the U.S. They're made out of scraps of wood, packing crates, massive issues. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president. He comes up with this idea of the New Deal. He's like, I'm going to end the Great Depression. I'm going to help Americans. In his first 100 days, he holds a special session of Congress to deal with the Great Depression. He closes the banks. They pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Once the banks open back up, they would be kind of reorganized. People now could have access to their money. He creates relief programs to help directly to assist the poor with jobs or money. Recovery programs to help the economy recover. Reform programs to prevent another depression. And then he also holds these little fireside chats where he goes onto the radio to talk to America and reassure the people. And while the New Deal didn't pull us out of the Great Depression, it gave people hope. These New Deal programs are often called the alphabet soup. He creates things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, all these programs to try to help bring us out of the Depression. Many of these are deemed unconstitutional. The Supreme Court starts to use judicial review to determine that these are unconstitutional programs. And FDR decides, hey, court packing. I want to add Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court, people who would support my ideas. This becomes known as a court packing scheme. So instead of 9 justices, FDR wants 12. But this is upset checks and balances. And in the end, it doesn't happen. Other people are criticizing the New Deal because the New Deal programs don't really help women or African Americans. It's mainly opportunities for white males. You also see that they're not really solving the nation's problems. Republicans believe the government was getting too powerful, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was too powerful. They believe it helped the wealthy too much. But what we see is that World War II is ultimately what had pulled us out of the Great Depression. All those men now that are unemployed are going off to war. Women now are moving back into those factory jobs that help support the war efforts. Unemployment is virtually non-existent. So that's really what we see. So not the New Deal, but World War II that pulls us out of the Great Depression. Okay. So I know some of you had asked me to go over the Cold War. So what I'm going to do is tomorrow after school, I'll focus on post-World War II. I'll focus on the Cold War, and I'll go all the way up through the modern presidents. This note outline can also be found in Google Classroom. And if you watch this and I wasn't clear or there's a question, you can ask me either in class tomorrow, or you can kind of tweet out a message. I don't think anyone's really tweeted yet, but hopefully I've answered some of your questions from colonialism all the way up through World War II, just hitting on those key points. If you have questions about essays, I can help you get some resources tomorrow for that as well. Thank you for joining me. Hopefully tomorrow I can figure out how to get my camera to work so you can look at my beautiful face here instead of a statue of Pocahontas from my trip to Jamestown last year. Have a good afternoon.